Good morning, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Knowles. Thank you for the introduction, Susan. And thank you for the invitation to moderate and be a part of the great summit that you have all put together. So it's an honor to be participating, especially with the group in San Diego. I lived there for almost 20 years, and now I'm in Ohio, and I miss San Diego very much. And it's nice to be online with some of my colleagues today. We're going to try to cover a broad range of topics in a relatively short period of time. So I'd like to start with Harper, actually, and interestingly, in addition to some of the things that Susan mentioned, I also have been a part of the Immigration Justice Project. I was formerly the director there several years ago, and so IJP holds a special place in my heart. Harper, I want to ask you just to talk a little bit about your work there at the IJP to give everybody a sense of the work that the IJP does with folks in detention in Otay Mesa. So if you want to just take it away, and then I'll ask you a few questions about what's been going on over there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel. So again, my name is Harper Otaka, and I'm an attorney with the ABA Immigration Justice Project. And our work primarily focuses on assisting and representing individuals who are detained, particularly at the Otay Mesa Detention Center. Our organization has several areas of focus. So first, we have the legal orientation program, which is what I work in, and I manage that program. And I can go into a little bit more detail about that. We also have the National Qualified Representative Program, which represents individuals who are Franco class members who are found to be mentally incompetent and cannot represent themselves in immigration court. And so we do provide direct representation to those individuals. We also have a pro bono program where we essentially refer individuals for pro bono representation. And we also take many of those cases in-house and represent those individuals ourselves. And so just to give a better sense.
Excuse me. Interrupt for a moment. Yes, and Gwen's probably saying the same thing. This is being live interpreted, so if you could just make sure to speak.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'll try to slow down a little bit. So yeah, and I can focus talking about the program that I work in. So I work in the legal orientation program, and the purpose of the legal orientation program is to essentially assist individuals who are pro se, because the majority of individuals that will have their proceedings in immigration court will go unrepresented. There's just a small class of individuals who are actually provided representation. And so the rest of the individuals that will have their proceedings in immigration court, they won't have representation. And so that's why we have this program. The legal orientation program is a national program, but IJP, the organization that I work at, we're the local provider of this program at the Otay Mesa Detention Center. Typically, the Otay Mesa Detention Center has about 1,200 people who are in ICE custody. And so our program is designed to serve as many of those pro se individuals as possible. Currently, under the conditions of COVID, there's significantly less people at the Otay Mesa Detention Center. And so there's typically approximately 300 to 400 people detained at the Otay Mesa Detention Center that we are serving. And we work with a very diverse group of individuals in terms of, individuals who have just arrived to the United States from very diverse group of countries, as well as individuals who have lived in the United States their whole life. And they're in removal proceedings, maybe because they do have legal status in the United States, but they perhaps have committed a crime that could mean that they would lose that status, or they're undocumented and they were apprehended by ICE within the country. And so we work with a very diverse group of people. And so I feel like that's kind of a good summary of the work that we do. So I'll just pass it back to Elizabeth to start with your questions. Oops, you're muted.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you so much, Harper. That's a great overview of the work of the IJP. I'm so just thrilled to see the IJP thriving and the amazing team that you guys have now. It's lovely to meet you online.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the rates of representation for folks who are in removal proceedings. You didn't get into the numbers, but the last time I looked this up, I think the percentage was about 14 to 16% of detained individuals in removal proceedings who have legal representation, and about 30 to 35% for folks in removal proceedings who are not detained that have legal representation. So for everybody in the audience, when we say somebody in removal proceedings, it's somebody that has to appear before the immigration court to have a decision made about whether or not they can stay here, they have a lawful means of staying here, or they are going to face deportation. So to your knowledge, Harper, have those rates changed at all?
I think they're essentially about the same to my knowledge. They are very low for detained individuals particularly, but I think that's about right.
Okay, and I think of special interest to our audience today is also like, how can the public or people who are watching today volunteer with the IJP and help folks in detention?
One of the biggest things that we're always looking for are interpreters. Because we work with such a diverse group of individuals that are detained at the Otay Mesa Detention Center, we're always looking, for pro bono representation, for attorneys who are interested in volunteering, but also interpreters, because oftentimes we will have an attorney who's interested in taking a case, but maybe they don't have that language ability to help that person. So that's definitely something, even if you don't have legal training, you could potentially be a volunteer interpreter. So that's definitely something that we're always looking for, and especially individuals that speak a language other than Spanish, because that's usually where there's a vacuum of interpreters. Sometimes it can be harder to find certain languages. So if you speak another language or know somebody else that speaks another language, that would definitely be a huge help if you're interested in volunteering in that way.
Awesome. Yes, that's like a universal need for all the nonprofits throughout the United States. And yeah, I mean, it's the languages that we're always in need of here in Ohio are like Tigrinya. Gosh, like I'm drawing a blank right now, but several exotic languages we've come into a need for, like Dendi. And right now I have a client from Guinea. I mean, after I moved to Ohio, there were languages I hadn't even heard of, and I thought I had heard of a lot. Mori Masi or Masi Mori from Burkina Faso. So very, yes, if anybody speaks any languages or knows anybody, I mean, it's such a value and such a need that we constantly have. What about bonds? Harper, are you guys doing much bond representation? And if you are, what sort of trends are you seeing?
So, I mean, we, especially during when COVID hit the Otay Mesa Detention Center, we had a really huge effort at our organization to provide representation focusing on bond and parole. And so because of the situation, because there were so many individuals who ended up becoming sick with COVID-19, there was a lot of interest with volunteers to help. So we were grateful that there was such interest at that time. But I mean, we had a lot of success, particularly during the period when the outbreak was particularly bad. But I think one thing that we have observed is because currently right now, the cases of individuals who are detained at the Otay-Mesa Detention Center, they're being heard oftentimes by judges that are at the San Diego Immigration Court. There was a lot of changes in terms of judges that were serving for individuals that are detained at Otay. And so, there's a lot of mixed experience, but I would say a lot of negative experiences of pro se individuals getting denied bond or very high bond. And maybe it's a trend because, they're not judges are typically serving the detained population. But that was unfortunate to see that even during the outbreak of the COVID-19 at the Otay-Mesa Detention Center, we still saw, very high bonds being set for individuals, despite obviously the dire need for them to be released. But we've had a lot of great success despite that in terms of bond and parole as well.
Good. And you said parole, which was my next question. What has parole been looking like in San Diego? I mean, are requests being granted regularly, or?
I would say generally, under the Trump administration, it's been much more difficult for individuals to get parole despite having all the necessary documents, despite even not having, a criminal history. It's been still challenging where cases before it would have been, an obvious person that would have been granted parole. So, I don't know what the exact rate is. I do think that the pandemic perpetuated sort of more releases and more grants of parole. And I think that continues to influence the parole grants. But we continue to see, parole denials for individuals, who sometimes there's no rhyme or reason why they were denied parole, despite them having.
Sorry to interrupt you, Herbert. And just for our participants who are our audience, could you just give a brief overview of the difference between bond and parole for our clients?
Yeah. So parole is something that would be decided by an immigration officer, so an ICE agent. A bond hearing is something that an individual would have before an immigration judge. And so certain individuals aren't necessarily eligible for a bond hearing, particularly individuals who present themselves at a port of entry. And so once they're detained, and they're able to apply for parole, it's essentially at ICE's discretion to decide to release them. And so they have that power. And oftentimes you'll see a big difference in terms of, what evidence an individual will have. Maybe it'll be the same for one person who goes to have a bond hearing before an immigration judge. Essentially, another person with the same evidence could be denied parole. And so even if they have all the required documents, it's ultimately at the discretion of ICE to release them.
Thank you for that. And we always want our clients to be eligible for parole. I'm sorry, for a bond hearing. And technically they call it a redetermination of custody, right? Because there's already a determination about custody once they're detained. But the advantage of bond, one of the biggest advantages of bond over parole is there's an appeal process. Whereas with parole, you can't appeal it, even though you can apply over and over again, but usually to the same result.
Yeah.
So thank you for that overview. I'm going to come back to you and ask you some other questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'd like to talk with Andrew now. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Elizabeth.
How are you? Nice to see you.
We miss you here in San Diego.
Oh, I miss being there too. I miss all you guys. It's been a while since I've been there, and the snow was about to come to Ohio, so I always miss San Diego even more this time of year. I'd like to ask you to give the whole group an overview of the MPP program, and then to just give us your take on how that's been and where it's going.
Sure. So what I'd like to cover is not only the current law affecting asylum, so things like the Remain in Mexico MPP, but also a bit of the history of the law, because we tend to have a very short-term memory of our own history in the US. And so there's certainly a very rich and noble history of taking in refugees and migrants from around the world. But there's also a pretty dark side to that, which is also in conflict. And so the history of U.S. immigration law is very much this back and forth between welcoming others on one side and this certain degree of xenophobia and just outright racism on the other. And that's certainly not to spare the current administration from criticism or responsibility, because in many ways, what's happened over the last 4 years, including things like Remain in Mexico and other programs, travel bans, is a return to some of the more shameful policies of the past, with the addition of some new and fairly cruel additions that I think will be judged pretty harshly one day. So right before I talk about Remain in Mexico and other current policies and humanitarian crises, let's take a quick look at what the law has been up until this point, and how the law has dealt with issues of immigration, specifically asylum seekers, to see how we kind of got to this point. And so if we look back at, give me 1 second here, see if this is going to work. I'm going to try to get fancy and share my screen, because what good is a panel of attorneys if we don't have a couple of charts to share, right? So hopefully everybody's able to see this, but looking back at some of the history of U.S. immigration law, even if we go back to the 1880s, things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, that was just an outright ban of a whole group of people based on purely just their race, their national origin. We have the Chinese Exclusion Acts from the 1880s. Going into the 20th century, from the 1920s, we have this National Origins Act of 1924 that, again, was very clearly based on ideas that one group is superior to another group, which itself was in conflict because at that time we needed to have immigrants to work the agricultural fields. And so there were these bizarre carve-outs for people within the Western Hemisphere, because even though perhaps south of the border we thought of them as the other, we still needed them to pick the produce. But it was very clearly this idea that certain groups were better than others. And that really comes down to essentially this idea of eugenics, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, that again, one group of people is superior to another. And this idea of eugenics was something that was fairly mainstream back in the 1920s and 30s, to the point where people within the Senate and the House of Representatives had groups that were based on this idea of protecting the American heritage against people of lesser quality. And so a lot of the conversation around immigration back in the 20s was based on this idea of eugenics, and one group is better than the other. And of course, in the 1940s, we have the Japanese internment camps, things that, today, looking back, the same court, the Supreme Court, which upheld those Japanese internment policies, just a couple of years ago, that same court looked back at their brethren from the 1940s and referred to it as fairly repugnant policy. But again, what's interesting is that the Supreme Court and other court decisions from a more recent history, the last 2 or 3 years, most of it has been because attorneys, legal organizations like the ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, American Immigration Lawyers Association, have challenged the current administration's Remain in Mexico MPP program, the travel bans, the Muslim bans, and taken it to court. And almost every single policy that has been challenged, the courts have struck down this administration's attempt to essentially go around what is the law of asylum, of immigration, and try to use executive orders and other regulations that do not require congressional action, input from the community. And so we're kind of back to what we have seen as what many people thought was our darker history of referring to immigrants as animals and murderers, referring to immigrants as drug dealers, and people that are running our immigration policy, people like Steve Miller, kind of waxing romantic about the 1920s and how we need to look to that as a model. And I think we should be very clear that when people like Steve Miller, when people like the Attorney General of the United States, Sessions, refer to the policies of the 1920s as some type of guidepost, that is a very scary thing, because they're saying
Excuse me, Andrew.
Yes.
The interpreters have asked all of our speakers, not just you, to slow down just a bit and to breathe so that they can interpret. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's part because this sort of thing gets me really riled up. And also, I'm a native New Yorker, so it's really hard to slow me down, but I will try. So again, a lot of what we're seeing now goes back to some of the overtly racist and xenophobic policies of the past. And so one more little bit of history here is that I think it's very important to remember that what people are doing when they come to the border and ask for asylum is they are following the law. Because the law of refugee and asylum is that if you are a woman in Guatemala and you're the victim of horrific domestic violence and your own government is not able to protect you, you can't go to Guatemala City and go to the US Embassy and ask for asylum. You have to come to the border and ask for asylum. If you're a family in El Salvador and you have to flee because the gangs are threatening your business with extortion, or they're telling you that your 13-year-old daughter is about to be married to one of the gang leaders and your own government is in cahoots, you cannot go to the Capitol and ask the US Embassy for asylum. You have to come to the border and ask for asylum. If you're a journalist in Sinaloa, Mexico, and you're being targeted because you're writing about the collusion of the Mexican government and the Zeta cartels, you need to come to the border and ask for asylum. So this administration is very good about messaging and trying to portray people coming to the border as being invaders and pouring into our country. They are following the law, and they're doing what they need to do to apply for asylum under international law and under US law that has been passed by Congress. And I think that's very important to remember. And so essentially what the Remain in Mexico program did was it's determined that people that normally would come to the border and ask for asylum, they would be allowed physically in, have what's called a credible fear interview to determine whether they had a sort of baseline claim of asylum. And if they did not, they would be returned. If they did, they would be referred to immigration court, given time to find an attorney and go through that process. That is now out the door, and this administration has determined that if they come to the border, they need to be turned away at that point, sent to these squalid refugee camps along the Mexican border. And the result for their cases is that it has been almost impossible for them to connect with legal counsel. They are in desperate refugee conditions where when they do ultimately get to court, they're essentially secret courts that are held at the port of entry, not accessible to the public. And I think it's also important to remember that part of why the administration is doing this is because they're hoping that people will give up. And sometimes they do give up. But what they also do is they get desperate and they decide that they're going to have to get their children, their families into the United States any way they can, and they will make the journey through the desert or through the river, a journey that many people do not survive. And so those individuals, because of the US policy of not allowing them to follow US law, are now being forced through the desert. And what the US Attorney's Office is doing through Zero Tolerance and Operation Streamline is they are now arresting these asylum seekers and referring them to the criminal justice system and forcing them to go through the criminal court system before they even get to the asylum system. And I think it would be very shocking to a lot of people if I were to say, I practice in federal court as well as immigration. If I were to ask people, what do you think of the sort of cases that make it to federal court? I think most people would say, oh, federal court, that must be for, the bank robberies and the big drug cartels and these big white collar crime cases. At least here in San Diego, which is fairly typical, would you be surprised to learn that 70% of the cases in federal court are now immigration cases, because our government has decided to now literally criminalize these individuals who are fleeing persecution and being forced to enter the country, as they would say, illegally. Or, with all due respect to our previous speakers, the ones that are forced to come through the kitchen window because they're not allowed to ring the front doorbell. And so these are individuals who are now being charged criminally. And this administration is also, in a fairly perverse twist, has tried to implement new regulations that say, by the way, if you have a conviction, even if it's a misdemeanor conviction, you shouldn't be eligible to apply for asylum. And so they are trying to further limit people's ability to legally claim and apply for asylum by putting in all of these roadblocks, many which result in people losing their lives, either because they are dying trying to get in, or they're being sent back to their home countries where they then are being persecuted again and often lose their lives. Elizabeth, before I can ramble on this for quite a while, do you want me to continue along this path, or did you want to direct me to anything in particular?
Well, this is very interesting, and you've gone into the question about federal prosecutions that I wanted to ask you. And yes, this next slide I would like you to talk about. So why don't we talk about the hieleras, conditions for folks that are subject to the Remain in Mexico program. And then I want to ask you about what we know about the incoming administration's plans for immigration policies that they will be implementing. So I'll give it back to you so we can discuss this, the hieleras.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's very clear that a lot of what the administration is doing is for the purpose of deterrence. They want to send a message. And they're not even hiding the fact that the people in the administration has specifically said, we are trying to send a message down to Latin America that you should not bother coming. And so part of it is through this Remain in Mexico program. Also, it's through the implementation of these inhumane conditions where if people are allowed to come in, men, women, and children, they are forced into these really cruel conditions like these hieleras, which literally means that the freezers, where they're, as you can see from these pictures, put in conditions where no matter what the temperature, these are just horrendous conditions, but they're also very much conditions where people are, 40, 50, 60 degrees trying to sleep at night. I think that, again, a lot of what they're doing with the MPP Remain in Mexico is forcing individuals to live in these tents with their families, hoping that they will just go back home. It's with what's particularly problematic about Remain in Mexico, among many things, is this whole out of sight, out of mind approach, which is working, unfortunately. I've been down, I know that many of my other panelists have been down to some of the camps in Tijuana. I've been down to the Matamoros across from Texas border, and the conditions are just horrendous. And people are giving up because as you can imagine now with COVID-19, what it's like in these conditions with the pandemic coming into the winter months, it's just really unacceptable. And of course, the other issue is the child, the family separation. People that are now being having their children taken from them at the port of entry. Again, sending a message that there is no legitimate policy justification for pulling a child from a mother or father's arms. And again, the administration is not even hiding the fact that this is done mainly for deterrence. We're going to separate these children so people get the message not to come. And as you've seen in the news, there are now, I believe the number is still in the mid to upper 600s of how many children are still separated from their children because this administration has just been unable to connect them with their families. And so these are people that were separated, and they're probably going to be hundreds of children who may never reunite with their parents, either because poor record keeping, some of the parents were sent back to their home countries, some of the parents might not have survived. Again, the government is doing this. For those of us on the panel who are US citizens, they're doing this in our name. And so we should be horrified by this, embarrassed by this, and doing what we can. And in terms of doing what we can, again, most of the successes in addressing and attacking these policies have been because of work by advocates, attorneys, organizations that have sued the administration, sued the different agencies. Probably one of the ones that I found to be the most emotional, even though you might say that the child separation is the most emotional, the one that really gets me is surrounding the travel bans and the Muslim bans, just because there was such a mobilization, not only among the community of attorneys who just went by the dozens, by the hundreds to the airports and set up these tables and said, I will give you free legal advice, just come to me, and just going up to people and saying, speak to me before you go to speak to anybody else. And just the mobilization of people within the communities and the public just going in mass. I mean, here in San Diego, there were hundreds of people across the country, hundreds of people going down to the airports, marching. It was a beautiful thing. And so I think that there's a lot of hope that, again, out of sight, out of mind works. And so we as advocates need to do a very good job of making sure that people know what's happening. Because when people realize what's happening, when they see pictures, when they hear the stories, that's when they mobilize, that's when they protest, that's when they vote. And so in terms of what we can do, in addition to joining in protests, we can educate people within our communities. If we're faith leaders, we can do that within those communities. And ultimately, we need to vote. And I think ultimately that is also what's going to save many, many lives. The fact that there has been a mobilization within the last couple of weeks, whether the current administration wants to accept it or not. And we do see some hope on the horizon. I think that with this new administration, based on the promises that they've made, and those promises, we certainly are going to hold them to it. They're going to probably terminate things like the family separation, the Remain in Mexico, the travel bans that are based clearly on racist, xenophobic policies. So I think that over the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of what we've been doing as advocates has very much been defensive, fighting the bans, fighting the policies, fighting the ability to cut back the rights of people to apply for asylum. And hopefully we're about to make a very fundamental shift into a much more proactive, what can we do to improve our policies? What can we do to make this country more welcoming? And so it's a very exciting time. And so I'm kind of looking forward to what's going to happen over the next few years, few months and few years.
Awesome. And so, Andrew, how are you at your office and other colleagues in San Diego and other organizations preparing for the change, if at all?
I think a lot of it is when we get calls from people who want to consult with us, making sure people understand that today might not be the day to file that application or to contact the immigration service and ask questions. But hold on, let us give you a call in a couple of months, or give us a call in a couple of months. And also doing a lot of advocacy with the administration. So through organizations like AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, we've put together a very specific list of priorities, and we've reached out to the Biden-Harris transition team and told them, we want to be your immigration experts. Let us help you understand what the policies are that are the most damaging. What are the things that you need to reverse on day one. So a lot of it is advocacy on the higher level directly with the new administration. And a lot of it is going to be on the state and the local level with individual clients, getting them prepared, understanding who our client base consists of, and being able to quickly mobilize and say, okay, that policy is gone. Who are my clients that are now going to be eligible to apply for DACA now that it's back? Who are my DACA clients, the Dreamer program, who are now going to be able to perhaps file for residency because of this new policy, and mobilize people within the community to spread the word, because unfortunately there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's a particularly vulnerable population, and so we need to have good advocates working with the legal community so that we can together reach out to the people and let them know what their options are.
Absolutely. I agree with you 1,000% on that. Every opportunity that we have as lawyers, as faith leaders, as activists, teachers, any opportunity we have to give facts about what we are seeing, the work that we're doing, the way these policies are actually playing out, and spreading that to the public so that they have a clear and genuine picture of what is happening and are not just being fed by certain media outlets. That really is paramount to getting to a place of understanding, and then a place of, okay, how can I help?
Elizabeth, the other thing that occurs to me is that my understanding is that this group is in some ways very, very international. And so there are representatives from people south of the border as well, in Mexico and Central and South America. So to the extent that there are people working with the communities down there, I think it's also very helpful to let people know that if they do come to the border, you're a practitioner, Elizabeth, you know the importance of being able to prove your case. And so
Yes.
if people coming to the border, and this is not always possible, but if they can remember to bring things like police reports and medical records and declarations, so it's not just their word about what happened, that would be very helpful. And so, leaders down in the countries where people are coming from, you can help prepare people. Those of us that are along the border, we can be ready to meet them and to assist them in that sense. And so, very much, I think we all have different ways, and perhaps the best analogy, I hesitate to quote scripture with this crowd because I don't want to get it wrong, but I believe that, following the example of St. Paul and realizing what our particular gifts are and how we can best contribute to what we think is the right thing to do.
Absolutely. That's all excellent advice and an excellent overview of what is happening. So thank you so much for that. And I do want to say that I find it very encouraging and heartening that our Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, has actually come to the San Diego border and gotten an intimate, detailed look at what the conditions have been very recently. So I was very proud and happy to see that when it happened, I believe just last year. So thank you, Andrew. And I'd like to say hello to Dulce and ask you a few questions about your work. Hello, Dulce.
Hi, everyone.
How are you?
Good, good. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you about some of the awesome work that your organization is doing. I learned from you about the bond program that you guys have implemented and green cards for kids. And I wonder if you could give some information about that.
Yeah. So just very briefly on some of the programs, I put on the chat the website address, www.borderangels.org, to check out the rest of the programs. This is just a very small glimpse into the work that we do. But this year we did start these programs out of need. Our signature program, what we've been known to do for decades now, is the water drop. And if you can see my screen behind me, this is a photograph taken earlier this year, right before COVID hit. of volunteers in the desert dropping water and supply. So I'm just gonna move out of the way a little bit, but you can see it's the desert here. And in the winter, you know, it's right around the corner where we get freezing temperatures, and we also draw supplies, not only water, but clothing and hand warmers and things that hopefully our migrant siblings can use as they're going through their journey. I do want to say that all of these programs are directly impacted by the policies that Andrew just outlined and our other panelists outlined. That this is the result on the ground of these policies, like zero tolerance, for example, the criminalization of our immigrant community that is pushing people to go through the desert. Right now, we support 12 shelters in Tijuana. In November 2019, there was an estimated 56,000 people that were needing shelter and food on the other side of the border because of the MPP program. So we have been supporting 12 shelters. And this year with COVID-19 and the closure of the border, we stopped our Caravan of Love program, where we would line up 20 cars and vehicles full of donations and take them over to the shelters. We stopped that because of the pandemic and the closure of the border, but we are still supporting monetarily these shelters and providing them for things like washer and dryer. You know, we tell people, like, disinfect everything because of COVID, make sure everything's neat and clean, but these folks don't have resources. So we provided some shelters refrigerators so they can provide healthy food. None of these shelters receive any help whatsoever from the US government or the Mexican government. On the contrary, the Mexican government has contracted with a private water corporation. And so now they're charging the shelters for water. And so we've been providing monetary support for them to pay for their water bills as well. Some of these shelters are housing 1 or 2 families because it's literally somebody's garage that they opened up when they saw the need of the exodus coming over, and they opened the doors. Some of them are churches, and they have the capacity to house over 200 people. And so some of the shelters have as many as 70 kids on there, and then some only have a handful of kids. And so all of these shelters are very different, and their needs are very different as well. Some of them are housing our LGBTQ siblings, and other shelters are housing women that have suffered domestic violence and are fleeing their home country and presenting themselves at the port of entry, being rejected, and then having to wait in Tijuana. So we support 12 shelters right now at the moment. We also have our bond program. As of today, we have been able to, and our very first bond was in January 7. So from January 7 to today, we've been able to place bonds for 63 people. The majority of them have been from Cameroon. And so, you know, it was talked about earlier about people presenting themselves at the port of entry. And to comment to one of the things that Andrew just pointed out at the very end, you know, these folks are coming through Brazil, for example. We've had people come from Cameroon and arrive in Brazil and then go through 13 different countries, 13 different borders, through jungles, through mountains, through the ocean. Some of them have presented themselves or crossed over through Mexico in the southern border, and then they're being put in a detention center because Mexico is also doing the enforcement for Trump's immigration policies. And so because of economic pressures, now we see the Mexican government also apprehending, enforcing immigration law in their borders. So we had a gentleman who came from Cameroon to Brazil through many different countries, through the jungle, to Mexico, and then be put in a detention center for 6 months. Eventually, after she got out, it's trans woman, came to our port of entry, and then the US government put them in a detention center for 6 months. So that's when we step in and we pay the bond for them, because the bonds we have seen, the pattern that we've seen is that instead of releasing more and more people as the pandemic is ensuing, we saw that people that were coming from African countries, from Ethiopia, from Ghana, from Cameroon, were being given bonds in the higher amounts. So $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 that we're asking these folks to pay to be released. into the community where they usually have a family member that's waiting for them. So for them to be
I'm just going to interrupt and once more remind you if you would just slow down a little bit for the interpreters. Thank you.
I apologize. I, like Andrew, get all excited about it too. So we as a government, the U.S. government is asking people that are among the most vulnerable among us to come up with thousands of dollars for the release. It's essentially a ransom, right? We're telling people that are fleeing civil unrest or domestic violence or famine from their countries, presenting themselves at the port of entry, asking for help. And instead of us embracing them and hugging them and welcoming them, we're telling them they're going to have to wait in a prison cell for months until they can come up with thousands of dollars. And initially, when we started our bond program, we thought we were going to be able to reunite 10 families with the money that we had. But thanks to the support of the community, because we don't receive any government grants or any big grants from anywhere, the community started to sell cookies and doing bake sales and selling pencils that said "Abolish ICE," t-shirts, designs, yoga classes, cooking classes, dance competitions, everything. And so that's how we've been able to pay for 63 people to be released from the Otay Mesa Detention Center, from the Imperial Valley Detention Center, and the Adelanto Detention Center. Here in Otay is where we saw the first death from COVID. Back in April, when the restrictions were so great that they isolated people in the detention center, knowing that some of them would be positive with COVID, but they didn't really have testing available in the detention center. We were really ready and able to pay bonds, and we were told we couldn't because of the pandemic. So instead of having people released, even though we were able to pay for it, they kept folks in there quarantined. Now, I want to expand on the reason why we have to do this work and the circumstances that allow for it on the ground. We have created every incentive where we have a private corporation that is benefiting every single day from every person that is in that prison cell. Right? So where's the incentive to release them even during a pandemic when we don't have the ability to protect them? We were getting calls from people inside saying, I'm a gay man and I'm afraid of dying in the Otay Mesa Detention Center because I'm being harassed in here and I don't feel comfortable enough to report it because the agents are on the ground are a private corporation that responds to ICE, and then ICE is not being held accountable to anyone. No one holds ICE accountable. So we have people in there saying, I'm afraid of dying from COVID. I've been put in quarantine in a cell with 8 other people in one cell. And in this cohort, what they call a cohort, with 100 other people. And some of them are showing signs, but there's no way to test them. And we can't get antibacterial gel because they're saying we're going to convert it into alcohol for drinking. So we hear all of these failures and abuses, and we are getting all these kinds of reports of harassment inside of this detention center, but ultimately it's a private corporation that benefits every single day from the pain and suffering of these people inside of the detention center. And one of the first things this administration did, instead of increasing the number of refugees or asylum seekers that we would allow in, we asked for, or we, meaning the Trump administration, asked for more beds in these detention centers with the intention that ICE was going to be picking up more people within the U.S., that we were going to be putting more people in these prisons where private corporations were going to benefit from it. Now, we have this created the system where we're rejecting asylum seekers. They're having to wait 2 years in Tijuana, which is considered the most dangerous city in the world based on the murder rate. And for someone that's a Black trans woman, for example, they don't feel safe at all in waiting in Tijuana. And with the excuse of the pandemic, we're closing the border to them, and we're not processing them and telling them they're going to have to wait, and their court dates keep getting postponed and keep getting pushed and keep getting pushed. Where we just saw a family a couple of weeks ago give up, and they didn't feel safe to return to their country. And their court date had been pushed yet again from September of this year to next year. And then they see the desert right there a few miles from the shelter. So they're going to try to cross it. And so when the agents say and give the analogy of people invading someone's kitchen, we're talking about people that have endured so much trauma and they're so desperate, and there's no security of shelter, no security of food, nothing, no security of being safe from COVID in a place like a shelter where it's housing 200 people. You can't socially distance in a place where you're sleeping in a room with 200 other people and you have 70 children running around. You can't. When there's no access to education for your children in Mexico, when you don't have a work permit and all you're depending on is on charity on this side of the border, and when the organizations on this side of the border has stopped going to Tijuana. Some of these shelters broke down yesterday as we were convening because they're so grateful to all of the donors that support Border Angels, because that's the only help that they're getting at the moment. And so the situation's so desperate that they're going to try to cross through the desert, through the mountain, whether it's freezing temperatures or it's 120-degree weather. When it's 120-degree weather, the agents are less likely to be patrolling because they like to be comfortable in their AC vehicles. And so people think in their minds, this is the chance I'm going to have to not get caught. And so they cross with their 5-year-old, their 7-year-old. It used to be that predominantly it was single males that were crossing the desert. These agents haven't seen what we've seen. They haven't seen the diapers. They haven't seen the kids' backpack shoes, the little kids' toys, their shoes. We have personally seen signs of women and children crossing. So it's no longer the single male as it was many years ago. That's an old talking point. We are seeing asylum-seeking families that have been denied crossing the desert. In 2018, there were 283 deaths that Border Patrol confirmed. The new numbers for 2019, which have been overdue for reporting over a year, haven't been out, and we can only imagine it's because it's high. But for 2018 alone, 283 deaths that Border Patrol was able to not only confirm themselves, but also identify them as migrants crossing. There's so many things, factors that come into whether somebody gets logged into the death toll as a migrant crossing, because it could have been another agency picking this person up, or a local entity not reporting it as a migrant crossing. And so at the minimum, from what Border Patrol has been able to identify, it has been 2018, 283 deaths. And so many of our siblings are crossing through the ocean, and we will never know. Border Angels receives calls from family members saying, my brother was supposed to have come in. He's from Ethiopia. He was supposed to be on a boat, and he was supposed to have been in San Diego already. How do we know where he is? And there's just no way to know whether somebody perished in the ocean or not. There's no way for us to search unless they became custody of Border Patrol, the Coast Guard, DEA, or ICE, or some federal agency caught them. There's no way to know whether the boat tipped over and dozens of people died, as it has been happening and reported in the southern border in Mexico. And not only that, but I mean, we saw Valeria, the toddler, pass away with her dad crossing the river, and the picture of them hugging and being found drowned, hugging, went all around the world. And here we are still in 2020. And instead of making things more humane for people to migrate, we still close the doors to them. And so that's just a very small glimpse. I know we have a little bit of time, but the other program that we do have is the Green Card for Kids program. The Riverside County has identified children that are in their custody because they have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents. So these are not the kids that have presented themselves as a family. These are kids that came in unaccompanied, or that have had their parents pass away, or it's the family itself that has caused this abuse or neglect or abandonment, and therefore are in the custody of the Riverside County. The Riverside County does an incredible job of protecting them and filing sometimes even criminal complaints, and providing a social worker. But they didn't have immigration representation for them. And so we stepped up and provided an immigration lawyer for these kids so they can navigate the immigration legal system. There is something called a visa called special immigrant juvenile status that provides eventually a path to citizenship that allows them to be here lawfully, apply for legal residency, and then become a U.S. citizen. And this Green Card for Kids program, again, it's brand new. It just started this year, and it was to fill in the gap that we saw in the Riverside County by providing legal representation for these kids. Some of the clients that we have are 6 years old, and some of them are 17, 18 years old. And so it varies, and the kind of suffering and trauma that these kids have endured is it's just unimaginable to see them smile and not only survive but actually thriving. It's just it's really motivating for us to do this work. I do want to say that some of these kids are put in removal proceedings. The federal government invests time and resources to put these kids that have gone through so much in removal proceedings and attempt to deport them. And so it's been a difficult to be able to run these programs, knowing that it's our own federal government that is causing all of this pain and heartache, whether it's in the shelters or in the detention centers or representing kids that are, next in the removal proceedings. I do want to address what some of the Border Patrol agents had said earlier. The chief that talk to the officers about creating this imagery of an invader, of migrants being invaders. He was our Border Patrol director here locally, and now he's the head of the entire U.S. Border Patrol. So this is the man that is leading the entire Border Patrol with this mentality that creates fear of the others, so that when the agents are on the ground in the middle of the night and they encounter somebody that's crossing unlawfully, they're more likely to draw on their guns or have some sort of abuse and mistreat migrants when in their mind these guys are criminals, whether it's a family with a child or not. And so I do want to express that we did have a much better relationship with Border Patrol before this administration. And then Trump came into office and everything changed for us to the point where we've had to consult with the legal team to provide representation for us in case one of us would get arrested in the desert. Because when we're in the desert, we see Border Patrol documenting who we are, our cars, they make their presence known. And it's about fluffing their feathers and knowing that they're there. And this fear that has been created on us after we saw Dr. Scott Warren arrested in Arizona for doing humanitarian aid and being processed and arrested and prosecuted, and then having a hung jury, and then the federal government investing again resources to re-prosecute somebody that is doing humanitarian aid and doing the work that they do with the hopes of saving a life. That has impacted the work that we do here. And to know that some of our water directors, like James Cordero, who's one of our water drop directors, is in this watch list that was released by I think it was NBC that discovered a government watch list. We're in it, and for us to sit here and hear Border Patrol say, yeah, we have communication with the community. The reality is that's no longer the case. We're afraid of being prosecuted ourselves as well for doing what we think is morally right. Regardless of all the laws and the changes that need to be made, at the end of the day, it's not about a left issue or a right issue. We're talking about deaths and the potential for saving lives. We're talking about humane and dignified treatment of people that are migrating, because we see migration not just here on our border, but it's everywhere in the world, right? Over 20 million people are being displaced as we speak right now. So for us, this isn't about following the law or not. For us, this is about doing something for another human being. And as long as there's this need to step up and do this kind of work, we'll be in the desert as we have been every single weekend, even in 120-degree weather with our shoes melting over in the summer. We'll be there as long as the wall is up and people are dying in the desert.
Dulce, thank you so much. It was super informative, very powerful message. And we're all very grateful for the work that you and your organization are doing. Like I said at the top of the hour, we were going to attempt to cover a broad range of topics in a very short period of time. I'm just honored to be here to share this time with you and Andrew and Harper. Even though I'm far away in Ohio, I feel just very confident in saying that the San Diego immigrant community is in excellent hands over there. And I would love to be on with for another hour to talk with all of you. I hope that Dulce and Harper have posted information about how volunteers can assist your organizations. Just real quickly, Dulce, I know you mentioned something about providing even appliances for the shelters. If any people in the audience or people that they know, if you could give them information about how to donate their appliances to Border Angels instead of maybe like Goodwill or other organizations this year, how can they do that? We didn't get to the topic of providing sanctuary for individuals, but perhaps that'll be explored during some other panel during the summit. I want to thank the diocese for having this panel, for having the summit, for inviting me, and I want to wish you a great rest of the weekend, and thank you so much.